Hello and welcome to another episode of Love Selling, Hate Sales. Oftentimes, if you've listened to the show for any amount of time, you've heard me say that nobody went to school for sales and even less people went to school for sales leadership. And in this case, sales management and sales leadership. We have this problem in the profession of sales where we all fall into it somehow. We maybe went to college for one other thing. Our friend gave us an opportunity to do this. We got this chance to do X, Y, and Z, and we wind up in sales. And then the next thing happens, we're good at it. And someone says, hey, you know what? You should be a frontline manager and you should run a team. And you have no idea what you're doing, but you figure, well, career progression, that makes sense. I guess I'll jump right in. And then the next thing that happens, maybe you're good at that and you find your way because there's really no coaching or training out there for it. You find yourself in a sales leadership role. And now, again, you're left to your own devices because the air is even rarer up there. There are less people to turn to. There are less mentors and less coaches and those types of things to help you excel and project your sales leadership career forward. So today we have Shawn Buxton, who is a coach and consultant around sales leadership. And he's going to talk us through some of those things that we talked about, right? Like, how do we get into sales management, sales leadership? Is there a difference between those two things? So Shawn, thank you for joining the show. It's good to have you.
Thanks for having me, Josh. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you because, let's start with sales management. Because when we were doing a little bit of pre-show, you said there's a difference between sales management and sales leadership. Let's jump into that.
I have this annoying habit of differentiating between words, and maybe, to a fault, some people accuse me of, that's kind of splitting hairs or semantics, but I found that the better I can define a word, the more action I can take on, the more specific we can get about the actions we're going to take. So I do differentiate between sales management and sales leadership, not necessarily in the role, but in the function. So if I think of like sales management, that's largely around monitoring, measuring, from something as simple as like PTO all the way to forecasting. So not to say that that isn't important, because it's essential. But I differentiate from management to leadership, and I define leadership as helping people get somewhere they could never get on their own. And so that requires a much different set of skills. I would say almost anybody could be a good sales manager if you're just looking at the management duties, but very few people are good at sales leadership because there's so much nuance to the roles and responsibilities of a sales leader versus just a sales manager.
Do you think then a sales manager would not get involved with coaching at the rep level?
No, I think they would try, but I think it would be very haphazard and they would be doing a lot of winging it. And a big part of what I teach people that I work with in regards to sales leadership is the idea of intentionality and not winging hardly anything. And I think as salespeople, especially salespeople that get promoted to that frontline manager role, we may have a lot of talent, maybe we have a charisma. And so I think our kind of personality, we have a tendency to wing it and to lean on that talent rather than, lean on a framework or a tried and true process. And so, I would say that they try to do some coaching, but often there's no structure behind it. There's not a framework behind it. So sometimes it hits, sometimes it misses.
So let's think about if you're that individual contributor that's considering that move up, and whether maybe it's management and maybe it is an actual leadership role. What are some of the things that they should be thinking about now to even consider if the role's right for them?
Yeah, I think you have to ask yourself, do I want to be responsible for other people's performance? That maybe is the biggest question you should ask yourself, because you're not going to be able to go into that frontline manager role. And just to be clear, when I talk about sales leadership, I don't mean like a CRO or a VP of sales. I mean like anybody that's running a team. So that frontline manager, I consider them, they have the opportunity to become a sales leader. So that sales leader then, when they go into that role, many times their plan is, well, hey, I was a great seller, so I'm just going to replicate myself.
Correct.
I'll just teach everybody all the cool stuff I did. It doesn't really work like that, right? You might be able to pass on some of that knowledge, and in the coaching you ultimately will, I'm sure. But the idea that you're going to take these strong personalities that are typically found on a sales team and mold them and make them into little mini me's, it doesn't really work out that way. Even though all the intentions are there, that would be a good intention. It doesn't really work that way usually.
You're so right. I've been there, right? I've been in that role where, the CEO taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, you're doing a great job. I think it's time for you to take over and run this thing. And you have this feeling of, oh, wow, that's so cool that somebody recognizes something in me. And on the other side, you're like, oh shit, I have no idea where to even start. And then what I see happen, and I'd love to get your take on this, because so often as individual contributors, we complain about all these things, right? That management or leadership does. Oh, this and that, they do this. And then you get put into the role and you just punt and do the same things.
Yeah.
Right? Because you don't know any better.
Yeah.
So how do you do it different?
Yeah, and I think that's key there too, is that you don't know any better. It's nobody's fault really,
Correct.
except maybe the senior of senior sales leadership, right? That they haven't provided them with some kind of training. You think about all the training and preparation we give to the role of a seller before we put them in front of our customer, but then we'll take our most precious asset, our sellers, and we'll turn them over to just somebody that was a great seller themselves. And we all know the talents and the skill sets don't, necessarily translate over to the new role. Some of them do, but certainly you need a new skill set. But your question was like, how do you prepare them? How do you get them ready for it?
Yeah.
I primarily break it up into three areas when I start differentiating between the role of a sales manager and a sales leadership role. I think of it as culture, coaching, and communication, that you have to be able to master those three areas. And there's many sub skill sets underneath each one of those, of course, in those buckets. But what I take a lot of pride in is throughout my career, I've been able to work with a lot of really great sales leaders that were intentional. And when people work with me, they're not getting like me as a guru, because I'm not that. I wish I was that smart. But you're getting the 400 plus sales leaders I've worked with, their best practices and habits and the things that they're really good at. And when I started really getting into teaching and coaching sales leadership, I went back through my notes and I started thinking, okay, I worked with Jesse over here. I worked with Christy at this company. And what did they do that they had in common? What were the things that they were really good at that made them an exceptional sales leader? And so then I was able to crystallize it down into these three areas. They were able to build culture. They were able to put together a coaching cadence, and they were able to communicate at a level of connection rather than just contact.
Yeah, I think it's a great foundation. And let's dive into each one a little bit, because I think culture, especially in the B2B SaaS world, which I'm not sure how familiar you are with that world or not, but
I'm very familiar with it.
Okay, good. It gets a bad culture rap, right? It gets a little bit of that bro culture kind of rep that goes around and gets some negativity thrown towards it. So talk about building culture. What are some of the foundational elements of building a culture on a sales team?
Well, I'll start with the definition, as I'm wont to do. Culture to me is a set of beliefs put into priority, put into action, and accepted as the norm. So when we talk about culture, it's not the ping pong tables, it's not the Patagonias, it's not the free coffee, it's not the basketball court inside the office. It's none of those things. Those are part of a fun work environment, right? But culture is so much bigger than that. It's really what we say we want, and then it's what really happens. So we can send off our big shot CRO to some training session with me or you, and they can put together a vision, mission, value statement. But the reality of the culture is what really happens and what's accepted as the norm. The beliefs are one thing, but if we don't make them a priority and put them into action, and they're accepted as the norm, then that's not really what your culture is. Your culture is what really happens every day. And I think the mistake that most leaders make, even at the most senior level, is that they're building accidental cultures instead of intentional cultures, meaning they're just hiring cool people that are maybe that they have great skills, or they're cool, or they're nice, or, whatever, right? They're good to people, and they're just kind of crossing their fingers and hoping that something good comes out of it. And sometimes it does, but a lot of times it doesn't. But anytime you get people together, you're going to create a culture, whether you like it or not. So the first thing that I start with is, let's build an intentional culture where we know exactly where we're trying to go, which is our vision, our mission, what are the things we're going to do to get there, and then the values are, in what way are we going to execute the mission. I can tell you, Josh, most sales leaders, if I said, and I'm talking senior level here, a CRO, even a CEO, if I sat them down, I said, define vision, define mission, define values, a lot of them would get it wrong.
Yeah, it's a really hard one. Like you said, the culture defines itself sometimes unless you really get intentional about wrapping your arms around it. You said that you've worked with, hundreds of sales leaders throughout your career. Can you provide an example of where you've seen it work really well?
I've seen it work really well in pockets because I found that at a CEO level, they get really wrapped up in, and rightfully so, but they get wrapped up in like the company culture, right? The overarching culture. And some of the best, I mentioned Jesse earlier. He's a great sales leader I've worked with throughout my career. I actually took him through a management training program early in my career. We worked together and then we stayed in touch over the years, and we've ended up at the same company a couple times. And it's just been really great to see him own the fact that he has his own culture that plugs up into the company culture. Because as salespeople, we know that I've got a group of 7 to 10 sellers, and now some of them are remote, right? That company culture and the values of the company, like, respect or empathy, these are all good values, but they don't really resonate the same as like grit or drive or self-motivation. Like a sales team needs its own values to feel connected at that team level. All the way down there to that frontline manager. I coach my people that, hey, you're a frontline manager. You need to have your own vision, mission, and values, and they need to be communicated to the team. Now, obviously, they got to plug up into the company values, right? And it's got to all work together. It can't be in contradiction, of course. But just taking ownership, and Jesse's a great example of somebody that realized, hey, I have my own culture within the company culture. I have something we're trying to accomplish together here. And that builds that ownership and that sense of belonging that people are looking for. And the right people stick around, and the people that don't resonate with that culture that you're setting up, they feel out of place, and it doesn't make them a bad person, but they just end up going and working somewhere else. And so you end up with the culture that you're looking for when you understand, hey, I've got my own team culture that we're building here inside the company.
That's fascinating. I do believe that salespeople are wired a little bit differently. I mean, we take the majority of our compensation as a risk, right? We're not taking a high salary or even a salary in some cases for the upside. So you're essentially betting on yourself for the most part. So that culture has to live that. And it's pretty rare for the company culture to be aligned with that, because the majority of the organization is on some sort of base salary structure. Maybe they have a bonus, and they're talking about things that frankly don't resonate with the sales organization sometimes. So I really love that concept of creating a culture within the culture.
Yeah, and it bleeds over. So we always start with building. I actually call part one of my program building and protecting your culture, meaning I got to decide what kind of culture I want with the vision, mission, values. But then I have to have these tough conversations where I hire right and I fire right based on that culture. And that's where the protection of the culture comes in, to where, hey, we own this culture together and we want to keep it safe. So if somebody's not willing to jump in and be part of the culture the way we want it, then that's okay. You're not a bad person, but you can't work here. Nothing personal. And that's the protection of the culture. Then it bleeds into the coaching component, because now I have something to coach to. Without starting at the beginning with the vision, mission, values, sales leaders are left to coach to do better, work harder, sell more, right? It just doesn't, it's not specific enough. There's power in being specific. And so when I coach somebody, I can say, hey, listen, I know you're a top performer and you're crushing your number, but you know what? You're a real jackass, and nobody on the team really likes working with you. And one of our values is teamwork, right? And so to be part of this team, it's not just enough to hit your number. You got to hit your number in the right way, and it's part of being a team. So that means we want you to share your best practices. We want you to come to team meetings. Like, it's not just like we want you to, but you have to. It's part of the job. It's part of being on this team. Now you have something like a North Star to point to and to coach to. So the coaching becomes more meaningful now, because you can get more specific in the coaching. It's not just sell more, do more, be better. It's, hey, our values are this, this, and this, and they have to align with what our behaviors, our actions are.
Yeah, we've all heard of that Lone Ranger, right? Who just crushes, but they crush on their own, and they kind of Heisman anybody who wants to get in their way, regardless of it's a new person coming on board. They might even Heisman the CEO, right? It's my way or the highway. And that can create a bad culture around what you're accepting and tolerating as an organization, and especially as a sales leader. And I think that reflects heavily on you. So having the fortitude to be able to go and walk up on that person and say, this isn't who we are. We love your revenue, but not that much.
Yeah, but you can never have that conversation if you haven't first communicated and been intentional about creating a vision statement, a mission statement, a value statement. Otherwise, that rep is just going to be like, you know what, I'm selling. What do you want from me? I'm the top performer. What do you want from me? And most sales managers, especially frontline managers that are doing this for the first time, are going to be like, well, you know, she's right. He's right. They are just supposed to sell. But then you have the ripple effects of what it's doing to the rest of the team. So a sales leader, someone that's actually been prepared for the role, trained for the role, would be able to see something like that and go, whoa, hold on. That's not your whole job, is just to hit your number. We've got values. We've got a mission. We've got a vision of where we're trying to go.
Yeah, I love that. And when you think about coaching, right now, we've talked a little bit about the Lone Ranger and say we've moved them out, but coaching can't be a one size fits all, right?
No, I mean, it's got to be very customized. In my one-on-ones, actually, the approach I take is that it's a setup for the week of coaching that's going to come, right? So I say one of the mistakes that people make in their first time sales management role is they try to fit a week's worth of coaching into a 30-minute one-on-one. When the one-on-one is really about that customized conversation where I always start with the person. I'm like, hey man, how's it going, Josh? What's going on? Because if you are going through a divorce or, you know, your dog just died, who knows what, right? If the person is messed up, the performance is going to get messed up. So we always got to start with the person. Then it goes to the performance. And then if we see the performance is awesome, then we're like, hey, high five. How can I help you? You say, I'm good, man. Boom, one-on-one over, right? That's for your top performer. But if somebody's like in the middle, the performance is not so great, then we start asking questions. We look at the pipeline, and if the pipeline's not full, you know, if the pipeline's full, but we're still not closing deals, then we got to think it's a skill issue, right? But if the pipeline's full or the pipeline's not full, then we look at the process. Okay, what are you doing to now fill the pipeline? So it gets very customized based on the individual. And this is why a lot of people don't want to do one-on-ones, or they kick the can down the road. They get rescheduled all the time, or they only do them once a month. It's because they don't know what they're doing. They have no framework. They have no structure. Again, we go back to they have no preparation for their role. They have no training for the role. So they end up thinking the one-on-one is either shooting the shit and just seeing how somebody's doing, or it's a pipeline, or it's a deal review. It's just those. But it's really all of those things, right? It's all of those things and saying, okay, this week we're going to focus on this. Maybe it's a skill. Or this week we're going to focus on Josh as the person. And we're going to give you a week, man, to just get things right at home, right? I'm not going to pressure you this week. Let's give you a week. You know, keep doing your job, of course, but let's come back in a week and see if things haven't chilled out a little bit at home. Right? It is completely customized, and it sets up the coaching for the rest of the week. So in that 30-minute one-on-one or that hour one-on-one, ideally you should be having that every single week, and then you map out the rest of the week. Okay, we need to get together and work on this skill for an hour. And I want you to get together your top 10 discovery questions that you would ask a customer. And we'll get together on Thursday now, and we'll go over that. And we'll role play that together. That's the coaching. The one-on-one is to line out the coaching. It's not to do the coaching. But it is, you're right, very customized based on that framework I just gave you.
Yeah, I love it. And the identification of skill gap versus process gap, that is great. I don't think I've heard that before, but I love that.
Yeah. Well, it's important. And to your point, that's where we treat everybody as an individual, right? And find out exactly where they need help, because everybody's going to be at different levels.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So let's talk, you start to touch on it a little bit in the coaching, but communication. I think communication goes beyond just the coaching component. Give us the macro view of what you mean by communication, then we can drill into it.
Well, there's three levels of communication that I teach. There's contact, and there's conversation, and there's connection. Contact is, you maybe send somebody a Slack or an email or a text, and you say, hey, Josh, do this. Josh, make sure you follow up with so-and-so, right? That's making contact. And it's not that that's bad. It's not that it's bad at all. Sometimes that's all you need, right? But sometimes you got to have conversation. And the conversation, obviously, is, we all know what that is. It's, me communicating with you and you communicating something back. Being aware, though, of the fact that while we're communicating, that you've got a filter that's clogged up with all your negative experiences and insecurities and fears. And I've got one the same way. And that message has to go through both of our filters. And sometimes it comes out right on the end. Sometimes it doesn't. How do we ensure that conversation then is more effective? That's when we go to the level of connection. When we have a foundation of trust underneath that filter, I know that if there is a misunderstanding, and there will be because we're human beings, when there is a misunderstanding, I know that, hey, man, Josh has my best interests, at heart here. He's not trying to screw me over, right? And you know that I'm not trying to screw you over. That was just a misunderstanding. We can work together and move forward. The biggest mistake that sales leaders make in regards to communication is they have too high of expectations for the level of communication that they're constantly executing. They're just making contact, but they're expecting connection level performance, connection level results. And you're not going to get that without the trust. And I'll give you one more definition, or I'll give you one more little formula for trust, because that's one of those buzzwords that we throw around too, just like culture and engagement and coaching, all these different ones that we like to throw around, management, leadership. Trust is built when people believe, when they're sold, right? They have a certain level of belief and certainty. They believe three things. Number one, that you can, meaning that you're a competent leader, that you belong in that position. And this is where a lot of sales managers right out of the gate, I should say rather, have problems because they're not competent. They were given no training or preparation for the role. They just happen to be the best seller, right? But your team has to believe that you can, that you're competent, that you belong in the role. Secondly, that you care, that they're not just a number in your forecast, that they're individuals, and that's why we always start the one-on-one with the person. And then finally, that you will. They have to believe that you can, you care, and you will. Will meaning that you'll follow through on the promises you make, and what you say is what you're going to do. As you build that trust, and we all know that it can be destroyed in just one interaction, but as you build that trust, then it becomes more about connection. You and I now have a connection of trust. And so when I communicate with you about difficult conversations, you're a great guy. I love having you on team, but you're not hitting your number. That's a tough conversation to have. But if that connection is there, then we're able to communicate at that level. If all we've ever done is make contact and me just giving you orders, we're going to have a problem.
Well, we were this close to all your frameworks being built on alliteration, and then you messed it up with the will. We were so close.
I know. It's the enablement guy coming out of me. I can't help it.
Hey, man, I love me some good alliteration. I mean, come on. Yeah. Who doesn't, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the trust thing is really important. And if we go back in your trust framework to the can part, and we talk about a lot of times they can't because they weren't prepped or trained or whatever. We often talk about ramp time for a rep, right?
Yeah.
6 months, 8 months, 12 months. What should real ramp time for a sales leader look like?
You know what? I don't think it has to be that long. With my coaching that I do, and I'm not trying to plug here, but you asked me about ramp. When I coach somebody one-on-one, it's a 60-day program. And I'm confident at the end of the 60 days that they have the principles from which to lead their sales team. Now, they will have to go back and revisit the principles over and over, but they have the principles they need to be an elite sales leader. Now, they have to go put them into practice, but as long as they keep coming back to the principles, there's no reason they shouldn't be successful as a sales leader. Again, not because I'm so smart, but because the people I've worked with in my career are so smart, and I've gathered that all together. I'm like, hey, listen, this is what the world's best sales leaders do. They do these three things. You master the culture, you master the coaching, you master the communication, and you'll be a highly effective sales leader.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the 60-day thing is something that if you are walking into that role, and this is something I'd like to jump into next, you can help manage expectations to your boss. So you've talked a lot about the role in terms of managing down.
Yeah.
Sales leadership has a pretty heavy component of managing up.
Yeah.
And I don't think people realize that when they go into the role. What have you seen there in terms of pitfalls and do's and don'ts?
Yeah, I mean, this is really where it's really broken, is because more than likely that CRO or that VP of sales that you're reporting to as a frontline manager, they never had any training or preparation for their role either. And so they have wung it. They have, learned trial by fire, just get out there, grind, hustle, all this kind of, these platitudes, right? And so when you go to them, I've seen this before, when I'm coaching somebody and they go to their VP of sales or their CRO and they're like, hey, I'm building my vision, mission, values. They're like, whoa, hold on a second. Why are you doing that? We have a company. I've had CEOs say that to me before, like, well, I don't want the sales teams getting confused as to what our values are as a company. And I said, listen, Mr. CEO, they don't know what they are. Believe me. You think that everyone's got that memorized. Nobody knows what they are. Nobody is concerned about that like you are. So I think the real disconnect is in the fact that those senior leaders a lot of times haven't had the proper training for their roles either. Not to say that they're not doing a great job and they haven't figured it out, but they learned the very hard, slow, expensive way. And so I think that's what's important is being able to communicate up and say, hey, I want to get things done quick. I want us to grow fast. I want to generate revenue fast. The best way for me to do that is to have a coach or someone that has done this before that can help me learn quickly. I appreciate Mr. and Mrs. VP of Sales that you didn't have that. I also appreciate the fact that you promised you're going to mentor me, but we never got around to that because you're busy doing VP stuff and CRO stuff. But I don't want us to suffer as an organization, as a sales org, by me learning the slow, hard, expensive way when I could learn the fast way. I could find out what the best practices are. I don't need to learn from my own mistakes. I can learn from 400 plus other leaders' mistakes.
Yeah, and there's so much value from getting mentorship outside of your walls. I think that it gets a little myopic and a little tunnel vision when you just take what it's worth from the person who's above you just because you could. And maybe that person's fantastic, but yeah. I do recall the one time I was in a sales leadership role that I was leaning on my boss for a little while. And then I said, time out. Like this isn't going to work. I need to go to someone with a different perspective who's done it a different way, can give me different angles to look at. And I just think there's a ton of value in that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's always good to hear the different perspectives. And you think about it, a lot of these people that are leading sales teams only had one or two people in their lives that were teaching them. So maybe it was the right way. Maybe it was like 75% the right way. Maybe it was only 25% the right way. We don't know. So that's why, again, I think like the collective knowledge is so important. And the more you can hear other people's perspectives and then try to draw out some common threads, some best practices out of that, the more valuable it is. Again, it's nobody's fault. It's not the CRO's fault. It's not the VP. It's just been this big gaping hole,
right? Especially
in tech sales for so long because we promote people so quickly. It's just been there for so long that we're all used to it. And when I speak to somebody, I say, why do you think that we don't invest in our sales managers the way we do in our sellers? When statistically, the sales manager will stick around longer than the seller will. People are like, you know what? I don't know. I never thought about it.
Well, it's interesting then in a performance-based business where we obviously measure it by output, which is, revenue in most cases based on some sort of quota. Are there any other tangible outputs that you see when people come in with this intentional program other than just the number, or is it that simple?
I see that we create future leaders more consistently. People want to stick around. They feel more bought in, especially if you're working with a startup, which I really like working with smaller organizations because I've worked at big organizations. I've worked for Staples, one of the biggest office supply company in the world, right? I've worked with them, and there's a lot of value in a big giant company. And then I've worked at medium-sized companies like LogMeIn, which is now GoTo, but the creators of GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar, all that stuff. And then I worked at really small companies too. I think the reason I like working with leaders at really small companies is because they are willing to take chances. They are willing to move quickly, right? A lot of times they are forward thinking, especially if it's a startup. They're thinking, wow, maybe they are a younger mindset. But what I found is that they need to be patient. The teams need to be patient because there's lots of growing pains with those smaller companies. And so when you have a great leader, your sellers are much more generous with the amount of mistakes you can make, right? And the amount of mistakes the organization can make. And that goes back to that trust, believing that you can, believing that, okay, I know we messed up. We went down this direction. Marketing did this and we should have done this. And, whatever it is, we did the new comp plan and it looked like it was good for us, but it turns out it kind of screwed us, right? Like that, if that trust is there, they know there was nothing malicious behind it. They know that we're just trying to figure things out. When you have a great sales leader, you're willing to give them a little bit more grace in those areas. And so I think it's hard to put like a number on it like you would with just revenue, but I think it definitely, you can feel the difference.
You touched on something there while you were talking that I want to just get your take on, because there are so many different sizes of organizations and sales leadership exists across the entire spectrum. But they change as companies get bigger. not only do they change in the fact that there's more of them, there might be more layers in Staple for sales leadership than there is at Log Me In, right? So how do you, as a person who's interested in sales leadership, how do you identify where you fit in the sales leadership spectrum? Because the way I think about it is at the very highest level, you get into a big, big business. If you're the CRO, you're likely just looking at dashboards and reporting up to the board and the CEO. And then you have a little bit of downward angle. If you're at Log Me In and you're the CRO or the VP of sales, you're hands-on. You're probably working in every deal to a certain extent. How do you figure out what your fit is and really understand that spectrum?
I think you have to. It starts with the understanding that there's a difference between the management and the leadership components of the role. You need to be both. But you have to have people that you trust, right? That are great leaders below you. The more you have people that you trust, the more you can be hands off and you can do CRO things instead of being inside of every deal. I would say if you're a VP of sales or CRO and you find yourself inside a lot of deals, then you probably have weak frontline managers. Right? You have weak directors, maybe the next level above them. It's an indicator that you may have managers and not leaders. And so I always challenge myself, to let people learn, let people make mistakes, but give them the information they need to not make those mistakes. But they still will, right? And when they do, we try not to have catastrophic mistakes. But we want people to learn. And a lot of times people need to go out there and try things and feel the freedom to try things. It's a balance. And so many things in leadership are about balance. We talked a lot about training and preparation for the role. That's not to say that there isn't room for experimentation in the role too, right? And striking the balance between the two. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not. But when I think about it, that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, no, I get it. I think that it's a more dynamic profession than people think when they're young and they're getting into it, right? And you're in the individual contributor role and you may see the boss in front of you, but you may not see the boss's boss and the boss's boss. And there are different things and different levers that those people are pulling as they move up in their career, and kind of knowing yourself, having a little bit of self-awareness and who you are and where you might fit, I think is super important. And then you can apply the principles that you outlined here. So I Shawn, as we wrap up and we start to think about, the key takeaways, one is just intentionality matters so much regardless of what your profession is. But I think in sales leadership, when there isn't always a lot of intentionality, it's going to go a long way. And I love the alliteration-based framework, culture, coaching, and communication. I think it kicks a lot of ass because sales in itself almost becomes its own little living organism within an organization, just because to a certain extent, the folks who are wired that way and are putting themselves in that situation are wired a little bit differently. So really appreciate your insights there. Shawn, what do you want everyone to know who's listening to know about your coaching program, about you, where they can find you?
Yeah, find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with you there. If you're a sales manager, sales leader, aspiring, rep that wants to be in leadership one day, I love working with the frontline manager. That's my sweet spot. I don't coach like CROs and things like that. That's not really where I do my best work. My best work is with that frontline manager and helping them build a high performance team. That being said, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always open to answering questions, so you DM me is fine as well. Website, ShawnBuxton.com. And that's it. I take about 2, maybe 3 people a month into my coaching program and work with them one-on-one for 60 days. I don't do any more than that because I want to give them one-on-one attention. So you don't go to my site and do videos and all that. It's like one-on-one, just like me and you are doing here.
It's intentional.
Yeah, you got it.
I love it. All right. So it's Shawn, SHAWN, Buxton, BUXTON.com. I love the fact that you're focused on frontline managers. I can tell you from experience selling to and through software companies for the past decade, the frontline management layer needs it. And I think they should talk to you.
Sounds great, man. Appreciate you having me on the show. Great show.
It's great. Thanks for listening to another episode of Love Selling, Hate Sales. If you like what Shawn and I have to say, make sure you give us a review or drop us some 5 stars on your podcast platform. And until next time, we will see you later.